Okay, so we're supposed to talk about Hinduism the next couple of weeks. So reminder, housekeeping wise, that we won't be meeting next week, and that's on the calendar too, because I'll be on a retreat to Enchanted Rock, so I won't be here, and I think you're stuck with me doing this. So so no class next week. 2 weeks, yes. And we're going to start talking about Hinduisms, and this is even more important that I put the S on the end of that, because the truth is there is no such thing as Hinduism. If you're interested in the word, Hinduism comes to us, and it really means is the religion that starts in the Indus Valley. So I hope you see the Indus word there, and there's not a religion in the Indus Valley. Every village has some of its, now there's an umbrella frame, and we'll talk about the umbrella, but the truth is every village has their own practices. They even have their own deities that they have particularly allegiance to. So when you hear things like, well, there's 3 major gods in Hinduism, I mean, generally speaking, that's the case, although at the local level, they may have no interest in any of those 3. The worst introduction to Hinduism is from the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Has anybody seen that? Yeah. It's terrible in so many ways. First of all, it's just a bad movie. But second of all, it sort of shows these kind of like, I don't know, occult, bloodthirsty, thuggy people who do human sacrifice to the goddess Kali. There's no evidence that people quite do that. There is this understanding that there are gods and goddesses that are associated with destruction and death, but not as like killer angels, as a way of sustaining life. So we'll talk about that shortly. Down here in the bottom, underneath the map of India, and by the way, there are almost 1 billion Hindu people, because there's more than 1 billion people live in India. Now, we know that there's some Thomist Christians in India, down in Kerala. We know that there's some Indian Muslims, right? Although most Muslims got forcibly deported to Pakistan when the 2 countries got their freedom. And of course, there are some Hindus. There's a Hindu temple in Pearland. So there's people worldwide. But by and large, this is like the indigenous religion of India, by and large. Down in the bottom, does anybody know that sacred symbol? It's a Sanskrit character. So Sanskrit is a completely dead language. The only people who read or speak Sanskrit, I'm not sure they know how to speak it because it's dead. I'm not sure how they know the intonation is correct, would be essentially Hindu priests, right? So even more so than Latin, Sanskrit's a dead language, but that is the character Om. You probably know that one, right? Does anybody know what it means? Nobody knows what it means. No Hindu person knows what it means. Why is it the sacred, like, why is it the magic word? Because in the Hindu tradition, it was heard from the gods themselves. So you have to know what it means. The gods gave us the word, and as you probably know, it is a sort of a word that becomes like a mantra in meditation that's about becoming one with the universe, right? Like you probably don't say, you're probably not chopping up a chili pepper going, Om, 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 like that's not really a thing you're going to do.
Could it be like the first breath?
Yeah, it could be the first breath, and there's been speculation, like it means this, it means that, but I just want you to hear, nobody knows what it means, and it doesn't matter what it means. In fact, a great number of the scriptures that are like the famous ones, the Vedas, those were heard from the gods. They're in Sanskrit, but the average person in India has no interest in reading the Vedas. They'd much rather read the Mahabharata, which are stories that are remembered. And we'll talk about scriptures later, but like the Vedas are like really thin, the Mahabharata is really thick, and it's full of epic stories. I'll tell you some of them as we go along. The Vedas, I won't tell you so much. Stories about like what priests do and how it is you respect a god by treating its physical representation that we in the West would often call an idol. No Hindu person would tell you they're praying to the god. In the idol, the statue is a representation. Nobody thinks that a statue of Zeus or a statue of Kali is the god. They're an outward sign of an inward reality, which is like the same language we use in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, right? We just handle images of sculptures differently. But like all of us know that Francis out there is a piece of art, not a deity representation. Nobody's going to bow in front of Francis. Like, we know that. But if you did, you wouldn't be worshiping Francis. You would be worshiping the God Francis represents. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So sometimes we don't realize, like, we do that, but when other people do it, we call them idols. Like icons, nobody worships the icon. Nobody does. Icons are like sort of meant to like curate our prayers, not receive them. Same here. Same, by the way, in ancient Greece. Nobody thought Zeus was in a statue, but the way you treated the representation of Zeus was the way that you interacted with the invisible portions of the deity. I hope that's helpful. Now, it's really hard in Hinduism because it's such an ancient culture, and you probably know that a long time ago, the oldest cities in the world with like sewers and indoor plumbing were not in Rome. They were in like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. So these cities in India that were very large were technologically advanced until there was an invasion by an illiterate, dark-skinned people called the Aryans. Now, how interesting. I want to make sure you hear that. The Aryans were an illiterate, dark-skinned people. They were in no ways Swedish or Norwegian or Viking. Illiterate, dark-skinned people who destroyed civilizations far more technologically advanced than they. They did that, of course, with weaponry and disease, which is typically how that works. So I don't know what the Third Reich was thinking about the Aryan civilization. You probably know that the swastika was appropriated by the Third Reich. It is a Hindu symbol. It is. I don't know that it's an Aryan symbol, and I don't know that I would want to say that the Aryans are the superior race because, again, they're illiterate. So it's just like a very strange thing. But what do we know a little bit is that the Aryans were, they belonged to this Indo-European people who came in. Granted, they're illiterate, but they came in, and there is an interesting thing that there are certain words that belong to Indo-European languages all over the place. Like the Aryans worshiped this god Indra, who was the god of the skies and lightning was fire from the skies. And what do you know? Indra is the base for the word Ireland and Iran. So for Persian and for Gaelic, those are Indo-European languages to which the Aryans were tied into. The Ireland is like the fire island, and Iran is the place of fire. And, you know, in Iran, that ended up becoming Zoroastrian, which has sacred fires. Zoroastrianism, by the way, was like the most important religion in the world until it disappeared. It was the biggest one until Alexander the Great sort of took over.
There's still a few practitioners of Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, the most famous one, you know, is Freddie Mercury from Queen, right? Who is dead now. But there are, and in fact, there are more Zoroastrians in India than there are in Iran, which was native home, right? That has to do with Islam, pushing the Zoroastrians out. But yeah, there are a number of Zoroastrians in India today. Okay, so in the oldest time, and again, stories get muddled. This is not a story from the Vedas. This is a story from the Mahabharata. How'd the world come to be? Well, nobody knows. It's really old, but the story is there was this god named Purusha
Where'd he come from? Nobody seems to care. He just was there. And he had like 1,000,000 heads and 1,000,000 hands and 1,000,000 feet. And the other gods, where'd they come from? No one cares. They decided they'd make a world, so they chopped Purusha into a bunch of pieces, and they made stuff out of his body. So humans and animals and the globe are made out of God bits. So that's sort of the start. In that's a story, but then there's another story that one of the, I mean, just like we have 2 creation stories in the Bible that have a different sequence, right? There's a different story that there is this creator God that you've probably heard of named Brahma or Brahman, who sort of creates things in a different way than chopping up a fellow deity. So competing stories. And actually in the Hindu tradition, which is arguably the most polytheistic, so far we haven't had a lot of tolerance for polytheism, right? Hinduism has a lot of tolerance for polytheism because they say, look, truth is so big and so important that it can't be contained in a single expression. That's very different from our Western conviction that something can only be true if it has a single expression. We're sort of in the middle of like this East-West conversation where I think we're socially, culturally starting to rethink that a little bit. Has anybody read the Life of Pi? The Life of Pi is like sort of the postmodernist novel because it says the end of the story is like, which story do you wish were true? There's 2 alternate stories, right? One in which there's animals on a boat and the other in which there's people who act like beasts on a boat. Really unfair to the animals to compare bad humans to animals, but that's sort of how the story goes. And at the end, you don't know which story is true. So it's sort of interesting, and it's good to know, right, that we read the Bible, as we've talked about, from there's one kernel of truth when our Jewish brothers and sisters don't read that way because they read from the Eastern way. So Judaism is not a Western religion, it's an Eastern religion. Christianity is now a Western religion, but it had Eastern origins of multiple ways of talking about a truth because we can never contain it in an aphorism. Somehow we don't like that since the Enlightenment, but that's our history. That's our history. So there's various gods the Aryans brought in, like Indra and Agni, and ultimately when the Aryans kind of settled down and learned how to read, they mixed in with the other people. That's kind of where Hinduism, as we now think and talk about it, comes from, and that's where we end up with something called the Trimurti, and maybe you've heard about this. This is like similar understanding that this is not where the Trinity came from, but it's similar that there's 3 principal deities, and yet there's also some oneness to them. And so the 3 principal deities, maybe you've heard of them, are Brahman, Shiva, shows up in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, kind of, and Vishnu, who you probably know better as Krishna, which is a manifestation of Vishnu. We'll talk about the deities more in a second. Now, there is a really interesting thing about Hinduism that's really good to do off the bat. And often we're not fully aware that we do this. Hinduism has a lot of thoughtful human insight that we sometimes flatten to the point of not being helpful. I don't know why my slides aren't changing. Let me see if I can call the caste system. Is anybody familiar with this? And the caste system is a thing that continues to this day, even though it's against the law to have it. But Gandhi tried to get rid of the caste system. He made it illegal, but hey, people really, really like the caste system. Part of the reason people like the caste system is because originally it was not meant to be what do I want to say? It was not meant to be putting you in a box that you were locked into like a feudal role. The original caste system seems to have been an idea about different personalities in the world. Because what do you know? There are different personalities in the world, right? Like there are people who like doing things with their hands. And we often say that,
Usually we say it about small boys, which is an interesting thing, like, oh, look how boys like to do things with their hands, right? That's a caste in Hinduism. And there are people who are intellectual type folks, right? I hope you broadly get what I'm saying, is that we often use the same categories, like, oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner, I'm an auditory learner, I learn by discovery. But the caste system was really initially contrived to be that. Types of folks. Sorry, I just need a second to figure out what happened to my presentation. Unfortunately, as with many things we do, we took it to the next level and said, aha, there are types of people, but some types are better than others. And so as a result, we decided that the best ones were the thinkers. Now, I'm not sure that's much different from how we do society today, is it? Right? Your wages will be much higher if you are a lawyer than if you are a garbage collector. We know there are a few exceptions, like, hey, there's people who, they do really well with their blue collar business. But by and large, we kind of get it. Hey, if you're a doctor or a lawyer, you're probably going to make more money. You went to school more, etc. Okay, let's see if we can't figure this. There we go. So here are sort of the castes. Again, keep in mind, this was personalities first, and now we made it something different. So the Brahmins are the priest caste. And by the way, you're born into this. This is what's interesting now. It doesn't seem like you used to be born into a caste. Seems like people looked at you and said, this is kind of the type of folk you are. But now it's become hereditary because it was institutionalized, right? We talked about this way, way, way back at the very beginning, the difference between a sect and an institution, right? Sects, S-E-C-T-S, are new groups. They're flexible, they're fluid, but institutions are rigid, right? Sects are things people join, institutions are things people are born into. So the institutionalization of caste showed up with these. Brahmins are at the top, they're the priests. And hey, not different in the Hebrew system either. You're born a Levite, you're born a Kohen, you can't become one unless you've got the lineage. Then there's the Kshatriyas. Those are sort of, so while the priests are like the cognitive folks, they're the cognitive spiritual folks. The Kshatriyas are the administrators, the rulers, and the warriors. Now, warriors doesn't mean like foot soldiers, it means generals. They're the people, they're the officers in the army. They're going to be the people who are in charge of city government, justice, etc. Right? Again, you're born a Kshatriya just like you're born a king. You don't become a Kshatriya if you're not born one. Okay, then there's the Vaishyas. These are the merchants. The people who, what do you know, like making connections with other people. You know any of those people? I do. I know people who naturally make really good connections. They love meeting people and introducing to people. Money on or off the table, but again, they fall into the merchant caste because that's the thing they enjoy. And then there's the Shudras. Those are the people who work in the fields. They like to farm. So some people say the Brahmins are here, the Kshatriyas are like the arms, the Vaishyas are the heart people, like the ones who like the connection, and then the Shudras are like the needs. They're the ones who move around and do the physical labor. And then you have people who have no caste, and those are the Dalits, to use the Hindi word, or the outcast. Now, again, originally this seemed like a personality system like the Enneagram or like the Myers-Briggs, but now, if you're a Brahmin, you're the best, or if you're a Kshatriya, you're still important. But if you're a Vaishya, you're the best you can hope for is lower middle class or middle class,
And if you're a Shudra, you're the bottom working class. And if you're an outclass, you clean toilets and you can't touch things because you'll pollute them. Since you have no caste, you're bad.
So where did the doctors come in?
They're Kshatriyas or Brahmins. Yeah. Where do the electricians come in? Those are like Shudras or Vaishyas.
Or where teachers come in?
Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, maybe a Brahmin, maybe. See, the thing is, if you're a Brahmin, you can do almost anything you want. Almost anything. But as you go down the ladder, you have fewer choices. If that makes sense. So the Brahmins are the top caste, even though they're not the emperors. Yeah.
And our school system is set up the same way.
Our system is set up similarly, and the European system is actually set up probably better than this. If you're familiar with the continental system, by the time you're in the 5th grade, at least in Germany, it's been discerned whether you'll be going to the university, to the trade school, or straight to the workforce. There's only 3 tracks, not 4. Trade school is big in Germany. It's not disgraceful to be a plumber, but they decide that when you're like 10. So that is one small issue, right? And this is still true today that in German university, which is free, as long as you went to the gymnasium, the Brahmin school, it's free for you, but if you change your major, you have to reapply. And you may not be accepted. When you think about the average undergrad in the States changes their major like 15 times, like something like that. I don't know the statistic anymore, but it's nuts. Because we think it takes us time to figure ourselves out. Germans don't think that. I'm not saying either one of us is wrong, it's just a different system. And we do have, Tim, I think to your point, Kshatriyas, Brahmins, okay, those are the people who go to college. Shudras, I don't know, maybe they got their high school diploma, but it's true in this country, if you don't have high school or a GED, you kind of are an outcast, unless you're a brilliant entrepreneur and you had some people who sponsored you, so you had some advanced capital. If you don't go to high school or get a GED, what are you going to do? It's hard getting a job. Right? To get a job at Starbucks, you need 2 superfluous master's degrees. So, right? So, thanks for laughing at that. Okay. So those are kind of the types that then became a ladder. And as I mentioned to you, even when Gandhi was around, like the Dalits, the outcasts were real. I mean, people would spit on them. Your job was cleaning toilets with your hand. I mean, subsistence existence. And the thought was, the reason you were born a Dalit is because you earned it. Because in Hinduism, there is this thing called the transmigration of souls, which is reincarnation. You're born again. It's kind of like Groundhog Day, truly. You get to do this again until you get it right. But rightness is not one way. Rightness is a series of stages. What's right for the Brahmin is wrong for the outcast. If you're born an outcast, the right thing to do is be spat upon by other castes and do your duty. And if you don't do your duty, like if you say, I don't deserve this, you're going to get a bad next life because you didn't submit to your station that you were reborn into. We Westerners don't like that. So look, anytime a Westerner talks about karma, they're misappropriating the word. Karma, you all know this. You get what you pay for. What goes around comes around. We don't believe in that at all because we don't in the West believe in reincarnation. It only works if karma, you get what you pay for. You may not get what you pay for in this life, but it will come later. Our only equivalent to karma is you go to hell when you die. Right? You pay for it later. And we have to say stuff like that because, hey, we see apparently wicked people prospering. And so, well, they'll get what's coming to them later. I hope that makes sense. So when somebody says, oh, that's karma, like I know how we use the word, but it's not the correct usage of the word. You accrue karma for better or worse according to how you live into your station. And each station has a similar word to karma called dharma. Your dharma, dharma, is the duty of your caste or your class. So by doing your dharma, you don't accrue negative karma. A faithful Dalit can be reborn as a Shudra. And if you do your farm chores well, then you'll be a Vaishya. And if you're a good merchant, then you can be a Kshatriya. And if you're a good Brahmin, right, then you'll be a good priest. And if you're a good Brahmin, you'll be born as a cow, which is the highest station, is being born as a bull, a Brahma bull, no less. And then if you're really good, you make it out of the whole transmigration and you become one with the universe, which is called moksha. The Buddhist word for that is nirvana, but it's really quite different because we'll talk about it when we get to Buddhism. But the goal is not to go to heaven as a separate realm. The goal is to become one with the universe such that you're no longer an individual. In fact, if you think about the spiritual path in Hinduism, there is no individuality. The problem is that we think there is, and that's where we start accruing negative karma. The goal is to be one with everything. So we walk a path so that we're no longer individuals. Actually, Buddhism is very similar too. No such thing as individualism. Now you see, this is really hard for the West to contend with because we believe in individuality to the point of individualism. Any word that ends with ism is negative. That just tends to be how I know Judaism, but consider who called it Judaism, Christians, and we call ourselves Christianity, right? So just consider isms like racism, ageism, sexism, like the isms are not good things. Idealism, that's when somebody's too optimistic. All right, just consider the isms are not good words.
When we think about going to heaven, are we one with everyone or we are individual?
Well, most Christians believe that you have an individual afterlife in a common city. But if I was honest with you, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think most Christians think that heaven is much like earth. You have a heavenly palace. You get your own room. You keep your own spouse. You don't have to see those jerks you don't want to see because after all, it's supposed to be paradise. I mean, I think in general, we kind of project this life onto another one, but with the idea that, hey, like we won't be in pain and I'll get to do whatever I enjoy doing forever, which is sweet. It's just in no way biblical.
So how do we reconcile that with the idea that we are all part of God?
Well, what we say is we're all part of God unless you fail to accept God's grace, and then God will punish you in hell forever. Or if you vote differently from me, God will probably do that to you too, and I'll see you in hell from heaven. No, it's full of paradoxes, and I hope you hear. I'm just being honest about this. It's our view of afterlife socially. Your individual one might be different, but like the one we've been fed is full of paradoxes and contradictions. I mean, it's almost nonsensical.
That makes more sense.
Well, actually, a lot of Christian people say that. And, to be honest, the criticism is that many people say Hinduism is monism. That is, everything is a piece of God. So God is the sum total of all things. But most Christian people, Jewish people, Islamic people say, no, there's a transcendence to God outside of creation, like God exists outside of matter. Monism says God exists in matter. So in general, in the Western traditions, we have God as transcendent. That is, God is more than the sum total of stuff. A criticism of Hinduism from the outside in is that it is monistic and God has no transcendence. God is only, for lack of a better word, incarnational. I don't know that a Hindu person would accept that criticism. The other word you might hear is pantheism. Pantheism means essentially the same thing as monism. Most people say panentheism, God is in all and also has an identity outside.
Or animism, American Indians, God is in the trees.
Yeah, it's interesting. Animism is, it is an ism, right? It's a pejorative word, like, oh, they make idols out of nature. No indigenous American believed that God was contained in the lizard. They absolutely believed God was present in the lizard and in them and in rivers and valleys, etc. Right? So a lot of times this is us going from the outside, those people, they worship the earth. Well, that's partially correct. But they also, every indigenous religion I've studied, also has gods apart from the earth who are made known in the earth, which is why the way we treat the earth is the way we treat the gods. Christians threw that idea out a long time ago to our peril. As I've read the scriptures, the earth is the Lord's and all that's in it. So we don't own this, God does, which means the way we treat God's possessions is in fact the way we treat God.
That's true.
I think it's true.
Well, most Episcopalians think that's the case.
Yeah.
I think.
Except for that one line about dominion.
Yeah, because dominion, it's interesting. We misread the word dominion. Dominion is based in the Latin word domicile. A domicile is a home. So humans have homeship over creatures. At your home, when your child mouths off to you, do you kill them? No, you go to prison for that. We all understand that children are growing and maturing, which means in the home, they need extra considerations. We don't treat children like adults because they're not. We know this in our homes, which means that animals that don't share our cognitive properties are not deserving of animal experiments that are painful. In fact, they need extra consideration because they don't have the same language we have that allows us to convey ideas. So sometimes we think, oh, geez, the highest point of life is to be born a bull. Like that seems silly. There are days where I think that would be very nice. Just to be on the pasture would be great, right? So again, this is part of our tradition that we've turned. But original Christian Jewish folks, it's not that they worshiped the ground, they were aware that God was present in the ground, which is why if you're Jewish, what's the most sacred parcel of land in the world? Well, it's Jerusalem. Like God is in the ground, in the dirt, literally in the dirt. I don't know if you ever thought about that. What makes a place sacred is that we say God is in the place. So we'd like to pretend we don't do this, but we do it. Is God more present in the sanctuary than across the street? Well, no, but we did consecrate that, didn't we? And that's not consecrated. What does consecration mean? Hopefully it means we treat it like a special reverential place, but is God more present one place than any place else? As a mathematician, I can't think that, because if God is omnipresent, God is everywhere. Our brains don't like that. Our brains like bad, good. Our brains don't like good stuff in bad places. But surely that's what omnipresence believes, which, hey, there we go.
Y'all ever seen a Hindu ordering food at a hot dog stand? Maybe one with everything.
So, well, in general, Hindus will not order food at a hot dog stand for a number of reasons. I'm not sure I'd recommend you do that either. Okay, so Maya is the illusion. This is the whole problem with human beings. This is the human problem, is Maya, the illusion that this is the only life you get and that you make your own destiny. So just consider that American culture is like very Mayistic. And you'll hear about this in Buddhism too. Maya is actually the being that tempts Siddhartha into having family and kids and not being good enough to change the world. Like Maya becomes the demon in Buddhism. But again, this is all sort of illusion. That's the problem. So we need to get out of the illusion. Now, helpful to say that the part of you that gets reincarnated is your Atman. So the best equivalent of that is your soul. That's what we would say is our soul. And your Atman, just like in the Jewish Bible, does not live here. Reminder, Judaism is an Eastern religion, not a Western. Your nephesh, your soul, lives right there. And your Atman lives right there too. It's your breath. In Hebrew and Greek, spirit means moving air, which is your breath. And so what do you know? The Atman is all about your breathing. We'll talk about yoga too, right? Yoga is not an exercise class. It's a breathing class, which means it's a spiritual class because it's all about locating your center and being centered in your Atman in all kinds of positions. You know, the goal of yoga, and we'll talk about it later, is that if you can be centered in your breath while you're in, proud warrior and moving to eagle pose, boy, when somebody cuts you off in traffic, you can go right to your center and not enter into the illusion of that's more important than it is. It's not important. What's important is staying centered. So we imported the exercise and we left the spirituality out. By and large, that's the case. Like if you go to hot yoga, it's all about sweat and calories and getting my flexibility. It's not about being centered in my Atma. I'm a bad yoga student. I usually get hurt because I'm not thinking about my breathing. I'm thinking about my exercise. There's a story about the Atman. This comes out of the Mahabharata, and it is like once upon a time, the body was having a contest for which sense was the most important. So the first one was sight, and sight said, I'm the most important. You'll be lost without me, and I'll prove it. I'm going to leave you, and you'll see. So sure enough, the vision left, and the body groped around in the dark and was very grateful when vision returned. Next came hearing, right? You won't enjoy the world. You can't orient yourself. So hearing left, and the body had a hard time without the hearing, right? Was really grateful when hearing came back, and then it was Atman's turn, and Atman drew itself up to leave, and the body said, don't leave. We can't live without you. So this is the demonstrable story of the Mahabharata, that this sixth sense is more important than the other five. The other five rely on Atman to exist. Now, this is not like the Greek idea of an immortal soul in a body. Rather, this is the idea sort of again, like this part that's temporary. Like we were infinite beings, now we're temporary beings trying to get back to infinitude. And the way we do that is by discarding the junk. So karma, dharma, that's how we pick up baggage or dark marks, and the spiritual journey is to lay them down, to return to carrying nothing with us. In Hindu eternity, there will be no conception of selfhood. Especially in Buddhist eternity. Nor is there an Atman in Buddhism. So that's why we have to do Hinduism first, because Buddhism comes out of it. Questions so far?
I see signs of that nowadays. The biggest business industry growth sector is storage units.
That's interesting. Yeah. The things that we carry. And reminder to you that we actually have this word that because Judaism's an Eastern religion, the word sin means both missing the mark and archery, but it also means carrying a burden. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we repent from the sins when we, as the spiritual goes, lay our burdens down. And the burden may not be that you lied to your third grade teacher when you were 10.
it may be that you are still suffering from the death of your spouse. You don't want to give up the memory of your spouse, but you do want to give up the suffering.
One thing I always wonder about reincarnation, is this our second time around or our fifth?
This could be your 1000th time around. And what's interesting, and you'll meet this is really more in the New Age tradition, which in some ways has Eastern influences, that people start to say, well, I know this is my 75th time, and I used to be a queen in England, and before that I was a grasshopper. Like, I'm not convinced that that's an indigenous Hindu expression as much as that is a New Age expression. Déjà vu is not a Hindi word, it's a French word. So I'd like to consider that it's probably an appropriation of a Hindu idea. I mean, like we're always, so if you buy reincarnation, you might want to know what you used to be. No Hindi person actually really cares. The point is, what do you do in this lifetime you have so you can move to the next? Now, part of our criticism in the West, right, is that's exactly how you enslave people. You tell the serfs that the ruler has divine mandate, manifest destiny, and therefore they just need to obey. Otherwise, they'll suffer in the body and they'll suffer in the next life too. So we in the West are real critical of that. And I'm not going to say we shouldn't be. That is a criticism. So how do we escape? Like, how do we get out of our karma? And the answer tends to be in the word yoga. And yoga is, we know of yoga as like a stretching regimen, but actually yoga really means in Hindi a way of devotion. And it turns out there's 4 classical ways, and then there's the 5th mystical way. Mystics in every faith tradition are wacky people, right? Mystics, like, they color outside the lines. But the first one, the first general accepted one, now you can understand if you're a warrior, this is probably not what you're going to do, is ahimsa, which means nonviolence. So one of the ways of stripping off harmful karma is by being nonviolent. This is interesting to think through, by the way, that as we look at these 4 different types of yoga, and again, the 5th is just its own thing, they kind of match with each caste. So bhakti yoga is loving devotion to God. That's the people who go to church every time, or more likely they go to temples every time. They practice all kinds of ritual acts of piety. Maybe they get this through ritual. Karma yoga is where it's all about, for lack of a better phrase, this is Martin Luther, it's all about your works. You do good actions, because what goes around comes around, right? Another is jnana yoga, which is knowledge of sacred texts. What do you know? This would be the Brahmins, right? Who are reading Sanskrit, which is a dead language, so you have to have like educational resources to do that. So you may not be a practitioner, you may be a Bible scholar. It's often the case that Bible scholars are not the most devout practitioners. I don't know if you're aware of this. Most monks are not Bible scholars. It doesn't mean they don't know anything about the Bible, but they're not scholars. They just happen to practice the 7 daily offices and go to confession every day and fast every Friday. Right? I hope you hear what I'm saying, right? Contrasting those 2 things. And then comes the one we know is Raja Yoga, which is the royal yoga, the Raja. That is what we would call the stretching breathing class, and then the meditation. So those are like 4 ways of yoga. And then there's the 5th way, which is not just sexual tantric yoga. It can be, but being tantric is about coloring outside the lines. It's about like eating beef and pork and drinking all the milk you want and getting drunk. You do these things because since God is in all things, you choose not to avoid anything. And sure enough, there
The Kama Sutra you've heard about is a tantric yogic document. And you know, we're all adults here, so I think it's okay to say the Kama Sutra is not about how to improve your sex life. In general, in the Kama Sutra, like when intercourse is between people, orgasm is avoided. The point is to get as close as you can and not go there, because that's how you accrue sort of energy. So it's all about building up energy and holding it in, not releasing. Most people are not interested in that. I'm just going to say, like, very few people are interested in the outcome of the Kama Sutra. They'd like to use the tools of how to build the energy up, and they sure do want to release it. I hope that makes sense. So the tantric tradition is not about how do I get the most pleasure. It's based, like in all mysticism, God is in all things, so I can color outside the lines safely. This is like the poet Jalaluddin Rumi writes frequently about wine, even though you know in Islam, alcohol is haram. It's banned. But Rumi has a lot to say about wine because he's a mystic.
Doesn't orgasm mean little death?
In French, it does. It's called the petit mot.
They stumbled onto that on a foot.
Possibly so, but there is also this understanding, right, that this is like sacral energy. And you know, I would tell you probably, I heard an interesting lecture that said the Catholic prohibition against birth control is also based in this idea that there is something sacred. Again, I don't want to offend you, but about seminal fluid and being exchanged, because it's about energy being exchanged. So when you block that, you're sort of blocking divine energy. I don't know if that lecture was right. I heard it. It was interesting. I don't think most Catholics are like, oh, I can't use birth control because I'd be blocking divine energy. Like, I don't think that is the conscious understanding, but it was an interesting thought.
Well, you know, back in the 1940s, 30s, 50s, when people were going into a boxing match for a championship, they weren't allowed to have sex because that would take away their energy.
Yeah, and recently, I want to say like maybe it was 2004, there was this like big headline that the coach of the Italian national team had prohibited all of his World Cup athletes. He said you have to be celibate so that we save that energy for the finals. It's sort of an interesting, they didn't make it. Anyway, somebody cheated. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an interesting concept, but it is very old concept. It is truly a very old concept. And again, because of, this is not our Christian tradition, this is our puritanical tradition. We don't like to talk about stuff like that because of we came from the Puritans. And I don't know if you're familiar that the Irish church had no problem talking about church under Patrick. Patrick didn't talk about sexual mores at all. In fact, Saint Bridget, our patron saint, who probably wasn't a real person, there's a classic story that a new nun came into the monastery and became pregnant. And Bridget prayed for an abortion and the nun got one. And why did Bridget do that? Because if the lady had been pregnant and been found out, she'd have been kicked out and been forced to be a prostitute or starve. So curious that Saint Bridget prayed for an abortion. Whereas now, right, Catholics are loath to consider that. But that's a saint, Saint Bridget. Patrick didn't talk about, he didn't really talk about monogamy or anything like that. That was how the Irish church was very different from the Roman church. Roman church won out, right? That's kind of why we do that. Sorry, let me get back. Any questions on this, by the way?
That's a lot of information.
Am I going too fast?
No,
No, it was quite fascinating. It was quite amazing. Thank you.
What about the world being on a turtle?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an idea, and I'll share that with you when we get the Mahabharata. Like, that's one idea. But not necessarily does any other, I mean, like, some Hindu people think that. But they think that more figuratively than literally. Like, they understand that if you use the Webb telescope, you won't see a bunch of turtles. That's more of a figurative reality than it is a factual reality.
I don't know if that makes sense.
It kind of makes me kind of think about, as human beings, stories are very important in our life.
Yeah.
And the writer provides stories.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really interesting thing in the terms of the way that Christians have used scriptures in the past, just as an analog. If you read, and I've written about this, if you're interested, the way the Gospel of Matthew uses quotes from the Hebrew Bible is bizarre. Like, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but then he goes up to this village called Nazareth, right? And Matthew says, as it was written in the scripture, he shall be a Nazarene. But that is not what the scripture says. The scripture uses the word Nazarite, because a Nazarite was somebody who took a holy, solemn vow to God for a short time. During that time, they didn't touch a dead thing, they didn't drink alcohol, and they didn't cut their hair. And then when the vow was complete, they went back, right? And Nazarite in Hebrew means guardian. So it's a guardian who's made a temporary vow. Well, what Matthew is doing is this really interesting thing where Jesus reverberates with these lines at a figurative level, but Jesus was no Nazarite. He drank wine, at least. He ate meat as far as we know. You know who was a Nazarite is John the Baptist. He was born one, never drank alcohol, never ate, never touched a dead thing, which means he didn't eat meat ever, because meat's dead. That's why he ate locusts and wild honey, because locusts aren't meat, they're bugs.
I was gonna ask about the locusts.
Yeah.
You'd eat them dead.
Meat, no, he just ate them. See, meat in the Jewish tradition, meat is only four-legged ruminants with a cloven hoof. So a fish is not meat, it's a fish. So a Nazarite could have got away with eating a fish. Poultry is not meat either. We think of it as meat. In the Torah, it's not meat. Meat is a split-hoofed ruminant.
Cannibalism.
Well, you can't actually eat your own kind. The Torah is pretty clear on that. Yeah, John the Baptist probably did not eat his parents. Yeah. Okay, so let me move over then and talk about divinities for a second. So here's let me tell you about the turtles too. The turtle story in the world, I mentioned to you, it's not a literal story, but the whole turtle story is once upon a time, the world was going to fall into the abyss. And one of the three gods, that's Vishnu, became a big turtle and shouldered the world so it wouldn't fall. So when you say the world is resting on turtles, again, no Hindu person thinks that a telescope will see a big turtle. Rather, the world is only alive and making it because of the intervention of the god Vishnu. The turtle is one of the avatars. I'll talk about the avatars next. Krishna and Rama are other avatars, but Krishna has come in many forms, has come 9 times and will come a 10th time. That'll be the end of the world. Sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? Or like the 10th Imam. What do you know? Or like the Jewish Messiah and some Orthodox traditions. Most Jewish people aren't interested in that. So again, the turtle is the savior figure, the savior of the gods to save the earth we enjoy. I don't know if I express it that way. I'm not sure that any Christian person could really pick at that. I mean, don't we kind of say, like the incarnation, the world survives and rests on salvific activity of Jesus being embodied? I mean, that's like saying the world's held up by a turtle. Those are like equivalents. Okay, so let's talk about the gods, because you've probably heard that there's 330 million Hindu gods, and there are. Except that if you ask any like true believer of Hinduism, like how many gods are there, maybe there's 3 million. But if you ask, but really, how many gods are there?
There's maybe 30,000, but come on, now let's sharpen your pencil. How many are there? There's 3. But really, how many gods are there? There's 1. So once again, the understanding is truth is so complicated, it gets multiple expressions, not just one. You're probably familiar with the Hindu parable, comes out of the Mahabharata, about the people with blindfolds touching the elephant. So imagine 5 people who are not sighted temporarily touching an elephant, and they're all telling the other 5 what an elephant is like. The one touching the toe says it's really sharp and hard. The one touching the trunk says it's hairy and kind of wiggly, right? Are any of them wrong? I mean, not exactly, but they don't conceive the whole thing. So this is the understanding that sometimes we have a relationship at the village level, at the family level, with one aspect of the elephant, which we might call Kali or Ganesha, but that the elephant is actually one thing that includes all those bits. So we in the West say they're polytheist, although most Hindu folk, that makes no sense to them. There are polyvalent expressions of a singularity. Because remember, at the end of the day, the goal is that your Atman becomes one with everything else, not separate. That said, you typically will hear about these 3 principal deities, and they all have consorts. Not wives, but consorts, and some of them have multiple consorts. So there you see Brahma, and Brahma is the black and white one sitting on the lotus flower, and Brahma is associated with creation, and typically Brahma is not like the top of the pinnacle, because creation's done. There's also a couple stories from the Mahabharata where Brahma can't help in a situation and Shiva can. So Shiva or Vishnu get more devotion because they're the ones that can help now. But you'll see Brahma has 4 faces in the compass points, right? Looking everywhere at once. And you see Brahma is sitting on the lotus flower, which is the lotus grows like on muck, right? So it's beauty coming out of the muck, primordial soup if you want, right? And Brahma is got a couple of things. He's got the lotus flower in his hand. He's got the book. The Brahmins are named after Brahma. That's where they get their title. And I forget that other thing he's holding. And then he's making this mudra. A mudra is a prayer posture with your hand. Now consider prayer postures. We don't have very many in the West. But most people, when they teach their kids to pray, and I have to tell you, I find this so obnoxious when I go to an event, an interfaith event, they're like, let's all put our hands together. That's a mudra, but I don't have to do that. Thank you. But sometimes we teach our kids praying hands, right? That's a mudra. It turns out there's many mudras, and if you've seen the statue of the Buddha is often doing different hand positions, and those all are sort of different prayer postures. Ways of being. Did any of you come to the Enneagram workshop? In the Enneagram workshop we had in December, each personality type had an associated mudra, like a way of interacting with the world that would be helpful. So like this could be one of them, or putting your palms out open to like let go of things could be another one. And that's an old tradition that there's not one way to pray, but there are many ways to pray, to comport your body in prayer to match what's going on internally and externally. So there's Brahma doing one of the mudras. Brahma's married to Saraswati, not married, sorry. Brahma's consort is Saraswati, who is the goddess of rivers and learning. So there are lots of feminine gods in Hinduism, although the Trimurti, the big 3, are the masculine ones. Probably the next one to mention to you is Vishnu. Vishnu is the one who has saved the world 9 times as an avatar, like took on a body and then sort of left. And this is really interesting because you may say, well, that sounds a lot like Jesus. But when Vishnu takes on a body, it has superhuman powers. So when Vishnu became a turtle that like righted the world, like regular turtles don't do that. Vishnu was like a super turtle, and Vishnu was a super boar. And when Vishnu took on a human body, Rama, or when Vishnu took on the human body, Krishna, unlike the Christian version of the incarnation, where Jesus assumes every human frailty, Vishnu does not. Does that make sense? I don't want to sound like I'm splitting hairs. The Christian tradition is Jesus is like a human being in every way, even though most Christians don't act like that. Like Jesus didn't come in the room and read people's minds, because you can't do that. I mean, he made good guesses. He had insight. Maybe he was empathic. You can do that. Jesus didn't heal people himself. God healed people through the ministry of Jesus. Hey, that's true of Elijah and Moses and the other disciples, right? This becomes actually a really important point. Did Jesus heal anybody? And the correct answer is no, he did not. He healed nobody. God healed people through the ministry of Jesus. I hope you get it. Krishna does his own miracles, or Vishnu does, sorry, in avatar form. And what do you know? There you see him standing triumphant over a serpent, because he beat that down in one of his avatar forms. And there you see he's got the power of the cobra. And there you see he's wearing this lovely kind of lei. This is like a victory, an honorific thing. No, he didn't visit Hawaii in the 70s. That's when you used to get those when you got off the plane. They don't give you that anymore, by the way. So there's Vishnu. He's married to Lakshmi. Married. His consort is Lakshmi, who is she does a lot of things. It's funny. There's a couple deities that handle luck, and Lakshmi is one of them, and also fertility and learning. Although those jobs kind of get sworn out. As I mentioned, Saraswati has something to do with learning and wisdom as well. And then the third principal being of the Trimurti is down there in the bottom, and that's Shiva. And I wish that I had picked better photos, because Vishnu and Shiva both look blue. In fact, Shiva is the blue one, should be bluer, because once upon a time the world was being poisoned, and Shiva drank the poison to save the world, and it turned him blue. Shiva is the god who is the sustainer. So he is both the restorer and the regenerator of the world. So there is a destruction role. And it turns out that Shiva has therefore three consorts. Parvati is like the nicest one, but sometimes Parvati can get like cranky and turn into the goddess Durga. And sometimes Durga gets even more cranky and turns into Kali, the subject of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And what do you know? Kali has like 12 arms, and they all have weapons, and she wears a necklace made out of human skulls because she is the destroyer, the feminine destroyer.
I remember reference that.
I haven't seen it, but possibly so. Yeah, I mean, and that's not a bad thought, that an atomic bomb is like very Kali centric because of what it does. It's utter destruction. Yeah. And from a standpoint, look, it's going to sound like without empathy, but you can say, look, when times are overpopulated, you get the bubonic plague, and then the world rights itself, and that's Kali, sustaining things. It sounds very uncompassionate, but zoomed out, it's a mechanism of population control. So is COVID. And we prevented it with our human science from being as bad as it could have been. Maybe, I don't know. And hey, was the COVID vaccine a gift from Vishnu? Or was it a gift from Kali? Because it's going to give us autism, right? It just depends which article you read, I suppose. Shiva is blue, and Shiva is the ascetic one. So Shiva is the John the Baptist of the Trimurti, the one who wears like camel's hair against his skin. And Shiva, it's really important. This picture may not make it really clear, has messy hair. Like it's a disaster, kind of like Hagrid from the Harry Potter series. And it's supposed to be in one knot on the top. It's the top knot, and then it's just the disaster. And it's such a disaster. I'll tell you some good Shiva stories with it next time. That's my basic introduction. So this, I think, is my stopping point, and we'll come back here, not next week, but in 2. But since I've stopped, what questions do you have?
I think I missed, who the vanquished opponent is underneath the feet of.
Of Shiva? I'll tell you that next time, because I want to tell you the fuller story.
When we were in the party war, we were at a Hindu ceremony where the priest came down and everyone had the lotus flowers.
Mhm.
And they put a candle in it.
Yep.
And there must have been thousands there. It was just beautiful.
Yeah, and the lotus is a beautiful flower. And again, get the symbolism. It's a beautiful flower that grows on the muck, which is like, hey, we're in the muck of Atman, and we're trying to get our ways out into beauty by becoming one with the cosmos.
Lotus where you get the blue dye anyway.
Say again.
Lotus where you get blue dye, I think.
Well, I didn't know about that. I thought you got blue dye from a crustacean that lives off the coast of Tyre and Sidon. It's like the ink sac.
Yeah, well, that, but I think the lotus flower.
Has blue as well. Apparently, oh, I didn't know that. I have heard that blue raspberry candy comes from the anal gland of a beaver. I'm not sure if that's right. Because as you know, blue is not a frequently occurring natural product. And there is no such thing naturally as a blue raspberry. Like that doesn't exist. The raspberries are red or they're not red. Right? They're never blue. Anyway.
You're trying to educate him about ink?
Please do. Yeah, by the way, I don't know where any of this came from. This is not from an ink sac of a crustacean, I can tell you now. Okay, well, thank you. And again, we'll pick up here in 2 weeks. 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Yeah. That's for a couple of different reasons, and thanks for going along with it.